Hey guys, welcome back to Project Bodybuilding. This video is going to be my channel trailer, so this may be the first time a lot of you are even hearing of me and this channel. And to those of you in that camp, I say welcome. Now, what is this video all about? Well, this channel is all about bodybuilding, obviously, and over half of the videos I do are bodybuilding comparisons, which are videos where I take pictures of bodybuilders and compare them to each other and give my thoughts and then declare a winner. However, sometimes this is tough. This sport is subjective. It's a judged sport, and we all have different opinions. Even my own opinions can change because although I do have guidelines, I don't really have a set judging criteria and scoring system until today. In an effort to make my videos more objective and more realistic, taking in actual judging criteria into account as well, I have built not only a scoring system to score these guys with, but I'm laying out my updated and concrete judging criteria. This video does not absolve me of my bias and subjectivity. We all have it and always will, but this should keep me and my videos as objective as possible. In today's video, we will go through my criteria for both open and the 212 division, because 212 uses the same poses, same everything really. It's just bodybuilding with a weight cap, so they're going to share their criteria with the open division. This is also how the official judges judge both divisions. They use the same criteria. We'll talk about the whole physique criteria as well as the criteria for each mandatory pose. Then I'll show you guys my scoring system too. And in order to give you guys an example, we'll run through the poses and how I would score the 2024 Arnold Classic Top 2, Samson Dauda and Hadi Chupin. We have a lot to get into today, so let's cut the intro and jump into the video. If you guys like the types of content I do on my channel, be sure to hit the like button on this video and subscribe to stay up to date on all my future videos. So first we're going to go over the judging criteria. I have two things to look at. First we're going to talk about the overall physique criteria, then we'll break it down for the specific criteria for each mandatory pose. Now how did I get to this set of criteria? A lot of it just comes from experience. Things you pick up on from years of watching bodybuilding and so on. But a lot of this is pretty self-explanatory. We all know what a great back is versus a poor one. We don't need a judge to tell us that. But to make sure I was staying relatively in the bounds of what current judges actually look for, I took a look at an actual judge's videos. Tyler Mannion, a head judge of major IFBB events and the current vice president of the NPC and IFBB, put out an open/212 criteria video, and he puts out breakdowns of major pro shows. So he took what he said, actual opinions from an actual professional judge, and made sure my own criteria was in that realm. Because like it or not, those are the actual criteria, and I want my videos to at least be somewhat accurate. But I really didn't change too much though from my regular judging system, I have to be honest. Tyler and I basically already agree on 99% of things, and I was basically just judging like how he does anyway, so I really don't think I changed my criteria a whole lot in the grand scheme of things. This is still my criteria at the end of the day. And I do have one or two differences I was pretty firm on from Tyler, but we'll get into those. So to my longtime fans of this channel, rest assured that I really didn't change much, if anything. This video is more about making sure I was accurate and of course laying it all out in a clear and concise video. Anyway, what do I want to see from a whole physique perspective? Well, I look for a couple of things. Completeness, which means how developed each body part is. I don't want to see major gaps in someone's physique. I also look for symmetry. I want to see these guys in balance and with a proportional physique. The upper needs to match the lower, the physiques also need to match from side to side, back to front, all that good stuff. Strong points are okay, but if you have a strong back and your front is horrible, that hurts your balance. Same with a small set of legs and a big upper body. And this goes straight into having good shape or aesthetics. This is a big factor too, especially nowadays. I want a good X frame in a lot of these poses, a tight waist, and so on. I also would like to see a physique free of flaws. I don't want to see one riddled with injuries, suspect oil use, or things like that. And of course, I need to see these guys in condition. Detail should be present throughout the physique and every body part, and some of those telltale signs should be present. The glute should be in. It's never a glute contest, but at minimum they need boxed in. And really, as long as you're not hurting the rest of your physique, the more peeled, the better. And the lower back Christmas tree should be in too. Again, these things speak volumes about your condition. Everything should also be separated and dry. I don't want to film a water over competitors' physiques. And finally, of course, I want to see a good level of size, which is relative to the lineup you're in most of the time and to each physique, but you can't be small compared to the other pros in a lineup of a given show. Competitors also need good density to their physiques and size as well. Now, those are what I'm looking for just on a whole physique basis, but what about for each pose? Let's take a look at the criteria for each mandatory pose for the open division, and I'll give you some good and bad examples of each pose from the current crop of top bodybuilders. Now for the front double, I look for two things. One is the arms. We all know that. The arms are obviously very important for a front double biceps pose. So you do have to have solid arms, but actually the arms aren't the most important thing. The most important thing actually is the entire physique, but to be a little more specific, I mean the X frame. The front double really doesn't have a center of focus. The closest thing is probably the midsection, but very quickly your eyes want to go to the limbs, the legs and the arms. And it's all about how the lats taper down to the waist, and it's about how small the waist is and how much sweep the legs have on the bottom of the physique. And because the whole physique is really being being judged at the same time and really isn't a sum of parts, this is a pose where symmetry, proportions, and balance are very, very important. With that, I have a couple of examples. Let's start out with what not to do. On the left here is one of my personal favorite physiques, William Martin's. And on the right, we have Andrea Presti. Now, William has a big flaw. He has that 1-to-1 shoulder ratio. The waist just completely derails the pose. He has no X-frame, and that's a big flaw. And William has good arms, they're solid, but he's going to lose this pose even against some of the top amateurs because of that horrible waist and lack of flow. This just shows that the front double is not all about being a gun show. Now, Andrea Presti is a lot more solid in this pose. The lats are very wide, he has good V taper, and the arms are fairly solid. But his flaw is the lack of balance. His legs really let him down. He has a good V taper, like I said, but terrible quad sweep, so he doesn't have a very good overall X frame. But what about some good examples? Well, let's get a 212 guy in here. I think Keon Pearson is almost picture perfect in this pose. The waist is almost non-existent, those lats are so wide, and his quads have that big outer sweep. This is one of the best X frames of all time. The condition is solid, and his arms are very, very good. He has good forearms, tricep hang, and great biceps that both have the great fullness between the front delt and the forearms while having good peaks as well. Now, yes, he is using a vacuum, but in my criteria, this is a-okay. In any shot besides the abs and thighs, a vacuum is okay. An impressive vacuum is acceptable and can help your physique just as much as a great set of abs. I personally like the abs flexed a bit more, but it really comes down to what works better for your physique. Let's move on to the front lat spread. It's kind of the same thing here as in the front double. Yes, it's called the front lat spread, and the lats are incredibly important. In my opinion, they're more important than the arms are on the front double, probably because they take up more space on a physique. But what is most important is still the entire physique as a whole. It's all being judged at the same time. It's the X-frame and what falls under that. Sweeping quads, good upper body taper, and balance between everything. Now again, the lats are important. They're the second biggest factor, and I want to see wide lats. They need to jut out far from the torso, and they should taper well. I prefer not to see high lats. I want to see them taper as low as possible into the waist for a nice V shape. Now on the front lat, I also want to see some density and pop to what I call the extras. Basically, I want some good roundness and separation in the chest, some good fullness in the arms and delts. These areas should not flatten out when you hit the pose. Now a good example of a great front lat spread is Andrew Jacked. For one, Andrew has a lot of shoulder to shoulder width, so he has the advantage there, and he's filling that frame in. So his lats are very, very wide, and they taper fairly low for that nice V shape. And look at all those extra details in the not so important body parts. The chest is full and striated, the delts and arms are round, and the abs stay separated too even when elongating his torso. And in the bottom half of his physique, we see good sweep and detail in the quads. Even though he's so wide in the upper body, the legs still remain in balance with the upstairs. Now the quads do have a little asymmetry between them, so it's not a perfect pose, but this is probably as close as we're going to get. The opposite example of Andrew Jack would be Nick Walker. Just about everything is wrong here. For one, the balance is way off. Nick isn't the widest guy shoulder to shoulder, but still his upper body width combined with his thicker waist and narrower legs throw off his flow and balance big time. The legs look stubby by comparison. Not to mention, where are the lats? They're hiding behind those huge arms, which kind of goes back to balance. His arms are overpowering his torso. You can't even see the lats. The pose itself isn't executed well either. There are a lot of things wrong with this one for Nick, especially when you put him next to what we really want to see with the example of Andrew Jacked. Now when we move to the side for the side chest, we kind of shift focus. Those first front shots have a heavy emphasis placed on the X-frame and looking pretty aesthetic. But in the side chest, that kind of takes a back seat. The main thing I want to see here is size. Now this does include shoulder to shoulder width, not just the actual muscle groups. I do like to see a wider guy here in this pose, just like in the front lat. More on that later though in one of my examples. But in terms of size, what I'm talking about is you need to be thickly developed from top to bottom and have each muscle group filled in. They don't just need developed, they also need to have good separation between all of them too. The delts need separated from the arms, and likewise there needs to be separation downstairs between glute, ham, and quad. Now who are good representations for the side chest? Well, I think Big Ramy has, or at least had, one of the best side chest poses in modern history. He really has everything I want to see. He has thick pecs for one, they're developed from collarbone to sternum, and he has some good striations in there too. The delt is round and capped off with some faint striations there as well. His arm is also solid, the bicep has good mass and peak on the inside of his arm, and on the outside his tricep has some good pop. And as we work our way down the physique, pay attention to the midsection. Although it's a minor part of this pose, it can quickly become a major one. But not for Ramy, he's keeping his stomach flat and checked in the entire time. And finally in the side leg, this is quite literally the standard. He has the size, his quad has good height to it, he has great hamstring drop, and the glutes are developed but not overbearing. Perhaps even more importantly though is the detail he has. His side leg is dry and we can see that deep line separating his ham and quad. He also has plenty of striations in the glutes. This is probably the best side leg of all time, so you may not see too many like that, but competitors in the open division should all strive and hope to get this close. Now before we get to examples of what not not to do, I do want to highlight something I said earlier using Hadi Chupin. Remember how I was talking about good shoulder to shoulder width? Well, this is what I mean. Hadi is showing off just how wide he is up top, and with that he managed to look like a triangle with those big shoulders tapering down into a streamlined waist. Now let me show you an example of a poor side chest pose, right after I find one. Because really all these top guys have good side chests, but I think I found someone that kind of fits, not really. Here is Kamal El-Garni. Yeah, a former 212 Olympia champion, so this really isn't a good example, but let's put him up against Big Ramy so we can see the difference. And yes, this is an open guy, one of the biggest ever going against a 212 guy, but it's just an example and this will highlight the differences more. Big Ramy's side leg is much bigger and more separated, he has more lines everywhere you look, and upstairs Ramy's delt is also much bigger and has that nice rounded capped off look to it, and the pecs have a great difference between them too. Even for a 212 competitor, Kamal's pecs are weak. He has okay detail, but they just don't jut out from his rib cage like Ramy's do. So there's your example of what not to do. Not a great example, but in today's era there are a lot of good side chests. The rear double bicep is probably the most intricate pose to judge. There's a lot that's supposed to be going on from head to toe. Let's start in the lower body because this area is the most straightforward. I want solid quad sweep from the rear, and I want developed and dug out hamstrings. I would also like to see boxed in glutes at a minimum. It's not a striated glutes contest, but in a closed pose, leaner glutes are only going to help a competitor, assuming the other things are equal. I also want to see good adductors too on the inside of the legs. I don't want to see a huge gap between these guys' thighs. These guys' lower body should be filled in, filled out, peeled, and dug out. See what I did there? Now for the calves, I think they're important. I always appreciate a good set of calves. They can be a tiebreaker for sure. But let's be honest, the current judges just don't care, so I don't want to put too much stock in this body part simply so I can be accurate. If there's a big lack of calves or a big advantage down there though, I always mention that. They should at least be inconspicuous if they're not super good. Anyway, in the lower body, conditioning will matter a lot because things like striated glutes and dug out hams are needed for this pose, and those things are telltale signs of great conditioning. A competitor also needs to develop the inside and outside of the thighs and the entire back of the leg. Now let's talk about the actual back itself. I'll try to make this as concise as possible because like I said, there's a lot to look at here. I think this pose, particularly what we're looking for here in the back double, can be summed up in one word: detail. There are of course other things like thickness and density, but really all of these things fall under detail. I want to see a back jam-packed with detail and with some other things thrown in there too. In the upper back, I want to see good rear delts, good teres muscles, big thick traps, and throughout the entire upper back region, I want this area to be separated and popping. Now in the mid back, I want a lot of density. This isn't exactly detail, but I want thicker looking lats, and I want the bottom of the traps and the top of the spinal erectors to tie in, and never stop looking like big ridges lining the spine. And speaking of lats, they should taper nicely and lowly for that great V taper. And like I said, they should have some thickness in them as well. And in the lower back, continuing down, those spinal erectors should remain thick, and the entire lower back region should be tight. We should see a faint Christmas tree shape, even when the competitor isn't pulling their lats back. And I don't want to see thicker skin or wrinkles in this region. Now, as far as the arm and shoulders are concerned, it's pretty basic stuff. I want a lot of details on the delts, I want separation between all three heads, some striations, and separation between the delts and the bi and tri. And for the bi and tri, there should be good hang on the tri and good peaks on the bis. And the back should not be overpowered by the arms and delts. We've all seen guys that have bigger delts than lats. I don't want that. And overall, the back should have good width to it too. It's not the most important thing, but even in the rear double, a competitor's back should not be narrow. And the back should have that V shape, and with good legs on the bottom, a competitor should once again have an X frame even from the rear. Now, for our first example, let's throw out all the criteria and just take a look at what not to do. Here is Akeem Williams. Now, he is solid in the lower body. That's not why he's bad in this pose. And I don't think I need to show you an example of poor legs. I think it's pretty self-explanatory to know what bad legs are for the rear double. But that back can only be described with a single word, that being shallow. There's nothing going on there, and that's the most important thing about the pose: detail. And Akeem has none of that. His lats also insert really high, so his back doesn't have good taper. This also leaves his lower back completely devoid of detail. He has no mid-back thickness or lower back Christmas tree to speak of, and his upper back is basically just as shallow. Now let's take a look at another recent back pose, but a rear double that's already one of the best of all time. That being 2023 Mr. Olympia Derek Lunsford's rear double bicep pose. Starting from the top down, the arms and shoulders are great. The delts are massive, and he has all three heads there separated, and he's also not lagging that elusive rear delt. His bicep peaks are, well, peaking. And now in the back itself, where do you even begin? For one, his back is extremely wide. It's not the most important thing for this pose, but it only helps. And his back has that great aesthetic V shape. But let's take a closer look. His upper back is jam-packed with all that detail and separation I was talking about. The mid back looks fairly dense, including the lats, which again taper nicely. And the lower back is tight as a drum with all that jagged detail giving off that Christmas tree shape. And continuing our way down, the lower body is solid as well. The quads have good sweep on them, the hams are developed and peeled, and the glutes look like cheese graters with all those striations. And now that we've looked at everything in detail, zoom out one more time and note Derek's great X-frame too. Wide up top, cinched in the middle, and wider on the lower body again. Compare this to Akeem Williams' back if you're uneducated on bodybuilding. You can clearly see what constitutes a fantastic rear double versus a very poor one. The rear lat spread is kind of the opposite of the rear double, in that I now want width to be the most important factor instead of detail. In the rear double, that was flipped. It's like in the front lat spread, this is all about showcasing your width. You need good width in your back. And with having good width, it should preferably be tapering down nicely. I again want to see that V shape in the back. Now width is the most important thing in this back pose, but detail is still an important factor here. We won't see as much detail here just by nature of the pose, but a competitor should still have good depth to his back. I still want to see a tight lower back, defined traps, and spinal erectors. And in the lower half of the pose, just copy and paste what I said here from the rear double, the criteria doesn't change. And again, the lower and upper body should still come together to create a good X frame. If you want to see a great rear lat spread, look no further than Hadi Chupin. Hadi is incredibly wide, his lat to waist ratio is great, and if you look at the actual back, you still see details even though he's spreading those wings. We can still see the spinal erectors tying into the lower traps, and he has those thick columns lining both sides of the spine. His lower body is also solid, he has good quad sweeps, good hand development, and obviously solid condition evident from the hamstring detail and lines in the glutes. And if you zoom back out and look at the sweep and contours of Hadi's physique, you can clearly see that he has the X-frame shape I'm looking for. Now here's an example of a poor rear lat spread. This is Ross Flanagan. Now keep in mind the lower body is exceptionally good, too good, but more on that later. It's the back that derails this pose for him. He doesn't have the width at all, he's pretty narrow, and his back is devoid of any depth. All the back details kind of blur together besides a couple of lines in the lower back, but that certainly doesn't mean he has a thick back. Now this is an interesting dilemma because yes, his back is narrow, but now the legs are kind of hurting him because they're so big. Yes, they're the high point of the entire pose for him because of the size and conditioning, but they're too big for his back. Look how much his quads sweep out compared to his back. His X-frame proportions are thrown off because of this. He is bottom heavy. And that lack of balance makes his back appear even smaller. Let this also be an example that you need to have multiple aspects of this pose. You can't just score well on one part of the pose and not the namesake and expect to do well. Now the next pose is the side tricep, but this is a pose where actually the tricep isn't the most important. I would say it's tied for being just as important as the overall physique. Yes, this is another pose where I think the whole physique is really taken into account at the same time. Of course, I do want a good tricep. The tricep should have that iconic horseshoe shape. It should have plenty of raw mass to it, and it should be clearly separated from the rest of the arm. But for the rest of the physique as a whole, I basically just want a half hourglass shape. I want big thick pecs up top, of course a good arm, complete with a big striated delt and a thick bicep and a great tricep, and then I want the physique to flow down into a nice tight waist. I really want that streamlined look. The side chest is all about just looking thick and huge from the side angle, but this pose is slightly different because the waist is now on full display, so it needs to be locked in and detailed. That's very important. It ties everything in together for this pose. And like in the side chest, the lower body needs to be balanced with the upper body. I again want to see clear separation between quad, ham, and glute, and some glute striations ideally. So overall, the side chest was about mass. However, this side pose is all about carrying the size well with a balanced and streamlined look, while again maintaining being as thick as possible. Remember the half hourglass figure. And also, this is a semi-important note for some guys out there. Don't hit this pose from the front, and that's not just me saying this. The judges have been clear on this. We only have two side poses, so making this pose another front pose basically is bending the rules a little too much. If you're weak from the side, you're weak from the side. You can tweak your poses a little, but turning the side try into a front try is too much. You can't just take a pose out and swap it out for another, which is basically what guys are doing when they do that. The mandatories are meant to expose flaws, and that's okay, but you can't escape your flaws by completely altering a pose. That's obviously not very fair. Now let's get into some examples. I actually want to start with an interesting pick for my first good example, Ian Valliere. I know half of you probably just clicked off the video from me just mentioning Ian, but he is a good example, hear me out. Now you may notice that his tricep is basically non-existent, but that is why he's a good example. He does so well everywhere else that he can dispatch a lot of other competitors even though he doesn't have the namesake of the pose. Because remember, the entire physique is basically being taken into account more so here than in other poses. Everything revolves around the midsection and how it ties into it. He has that good half hourglass shape. And if you break it down body part for body part, he is quite good. He has a fantastic side leg, it's huge for one, he has great quad height, hamstring drop, and great conditioning. He has the overall grainy look to his side leg and striations in the glutes. Then going up, he has a fantastic midsection. He has some faint serratus and oblique detail going on here, and his overall abdomen is locked in. And in the arms, again the tricep is not there, but the delt is huge and striated, and his pecs, while not the most round, have some great detail there. So overall, he has a great pose despite not having a tricep. Now because Ian doesn't have a tricep, this pose is obviously far from perfect, but it's also pretty far from a bad pose. But if you guys want great 10 out of 10 examples, look at Hunter Labrada or Nick Walker. These guys have locked in midsections most importantly, although Nick's is a little better and his abs are better. They both have big and defined side legs, and up top they have great triceps. They look massive and thick as well as streamlined. streamlined. They're also complete top to bottom and have massive horseshoes. However, if you need some examples of a poor side tricep, first take a look at Andrew Jacked. Doesn't he look great? And no, that's not sarcasm, well, kind of. He does look great in this pose, but it's not a side tricep. It's one of those front variations. Even though he looks fantastic in the shot, he would get docked heavily in my comparisons for doing this. This isn't bending the rules, this is breaking them. Now, another example of a poor side tri is Tonio Burton. His tricep is pretty solid actually, but remember, that's not everything. Anytime Tonio is next to other pros, he gets dwarfed. He doesn't have the great level of thickness, and that hurts him in the shot. His pecs don't pop as much, and he doesn't have those half hourglass lines. All he has going for him is a decent tricep. Put him in between Nick and Hunter, and you can easily see what I mean. The abs and thighs is perhaps the most straightforward pose. I mean, it's in the name. I'm looking for great abs and great thighs, but what constitutes a good set of each? For the abs, it's again self-explanatory. I want good chunkiness to the abs. They should be somewhat blocky. They should also be very symmetrical with each other. Basically, they shouldn't look out of order. And between the abs, I want very deep separation. And just outside the actual abs themselves, in regards to the whole midsection, I'd like to see some good upper body taper. I want to see thick and wide lats tapering down to a small waist. In the lower body, it's basically the same as the other front poses. I want good size, good sweep, and great separation. Now, when it comes to the different variations, two things are acceptable to me. Well, one is just 100% acceptable to me, that being the head-on version. I would prefer to see this version 100% of the time, but I guess the twisting shot gets a pass from me. A less resounding pass, but I still see it as mostly okay. What I don't want to see is a vacuum. Yes, a vacuum is okay in the front shots, and maybe if you want to do it in the side chest, sure, I'm fine with that, but this is the abs and thighs. Remember, these poses are designed to showcase weaknesses. That's the whole point. You can't just completely get rid of your worst attribute by hiding it completely. It's like doing the front tricep compared to the side tricep. You're hiding a crucial element of the pose when you pull a vacuum. I like to see vacuums, don't get me wrong. It does score you brownie points if you can hit all these different variations, including the vacuum. But the actual head-on abs and thighs has to be the first and the main one you do. Altering your posing is one thing, but hiding the namesake of the pose is another. This pose isn't just about a good midsection, it's about the actual ab development too. Basically, you can't just get rid of a pose because you're weak in it. That's just the luck of the draw with genetics. You can't turn to the front and the side tri because we only have two side poses, and you can't vacuum your abs away and hide them for the only ab pose. It's the center of focus too in this shot, so hiding it doesn't make any sense from that aspect either. It's not like a vacuum the front double where I'm okay with it, because the actual ab development's not the center of the pose. Anyway, that's enough of the rant, let's get to some good examples. The first one is obviously Hadi Chupin. Look at those abs first of all. The entire core is shredded, from those diced obliques to the great separation between the abs. And he has decent taper for an open guy too. His lats are very wide, so even though his waist isn't the smallest, he still has okay taper thanks to those lats. And in the lower body, he's got a solid amount of sweep, but those legs are just peeled from knee to hip. Now, I do want to include another half-decent example of the twisting variation. Now, keep in mind, Hadi can also do a good twisting shot too, but I want to highlight Samson Dowdy here specifically. Samson's waist isn't actually all that small when he crunches down on it, and his abs are fairly shallow. And because of those things, his head-on abs and thighs is pretty mediocre. But he often opts for this twisting oblique shot, which isn't 100% ideal, but okay for the most part. And just look at how much better that looks compared to the head-on abs and thighs. We actually see good ab separation, and the bigger stomach isn't a factor. Now, if you guys want to see some poor examples, I got a couple. First, let's check in on your current Mr. Olympia abs and thigh shot. And yes, he is guilty of basically only hitting the vacuum. I'm not denying it's a great shot, he looks awesome, but this isn't the abs and thighs. He would be marked down heavily in my comparisons for this. And by the way, just in case you were wondering why your current Mr. Olympia is only hitting the vacuum, we'll take a look at his abs and thighs, which is another great example because it's so poor. His abs have no depth, his entire stomach appears washed out. I don't really know what's going on here to be honest, but it doesn't look good. And if you put him next to Hadi, you can see a stark contrast between some of the best abs at the Olympia stage and some of the worst. But if you guys want a poor textbook abs and thighs, look no further than Justin Rodriguez. Justin's abs are asymmetrical, the obliques are too big and are spilling over his trunks, and the overall waist is a mess. He's washed out in the lower stomach and has that weird skin texture there. And because his waist is bigger, the taper is not at all impressive. And we haven't even talked about the lower body. That front leg is good, but the back leg isn't. He has a clear imbalance here. And finally, we've reached our final pose for this section of the video, the most muscular. And this pose is another straightforward one. This pose is called the most muscular. You can imagine what's most important. I want to see muscle on muscle. I want to see every body part present and completely developed. I want completeness, size, detail. Don't forget the detail. These muscle groups need to be separated from each other, need to have good detail within themselves. And in terms of body part for body part, I want rounded and capped delts with some striations. I want the delts to be separated from the arms, and I want good outer sweep on the tricep and good thickness to the bi on the inside of the arm. Then the pec should be full and striated striated, and don't forget those traps. Those are often neglected in this pose, but they matter. The abs should also be detailed as well if you're choosing a variation that shows them. And in the lower body, it's the same like the other front poses. I want sweep and separation from hip to knee. And keep in mind, just because I want these guys to be massive doesn't mean that this is an excuse to look completely unaesthetic. You can be a freak in this one, and that's fine in my book. But these body parts should still all flow into each other, and you should have good balance. You can still look like a mass monster, just don't look like a mess. I don't want to see overpowering delts or an imbalance between the upper and lower halves, and your waist should be in check too. That's the one thing in this pose that I don't want to be massive. Now when it comes to the different variations in the most muscular, I'm pretty lenient. In fact, if you can hit multiple variations of this pose, I'll be even more impressed. But from the hands clasped to the hands on hip shot to the crab shot, it doesn't matter for this pose, it comes down to personal preference. But a competitor should figure out which one looks best for them. If I see that a better choice could have been made, I'm not afraid to say so. Now, if one wants to see a great example of a poor most muscular, take a look at the very aesthetic guy. Take a look at this very aesthetic guy, but a guy that's not really built for this pose quite yet, Rican Grimes. He looks great. He looks very aesthetic, but that's not exactly what I'm after here. Sure, he looks great and in balance, but he's missing size and thickness everywhere. But that's not really evident by himself, so let's put him next to my good example, Michael Krizo. Krizo is much more developed in detail in the chest, his delts are bigger, the arms are thicker, and the legs have slightly crisper separation. Like the pose is named, Krizo is the most muscular. Krizo manages to look massive and completely developed top to bottom, but he's not letting his gut hang out, and everything is fairly balanced. He's ripped, he's full, he's big, he can hit a couple variations, and that's what makes a great most muscular pose. Now we've finally gone through all the mandatories and what I'm looking for in each of them, so now that we've done that, what I'm going to do now is break down my new scoring system. Again, long-time viewers need not worry. This doesn't exactly change the way I've been doing my videos. I'm clearly still looking at the same criteria, but now I'm going to start quantifying my two-way comparisons with some solid numbers. And yes, this is just my scoring system for the two-way comparisons. My multi-way comparisons will be kept the same. And just for review, I rank each guy in a pose from 1 to however many guys there are, so if I think a guy wins a pose, he gets 1 point. And if I think another guy gets third, he gets 3 points. And so on. So in multi-way comparisons, the lowest score out of the bunch wins. That's how I've always done those comparisons, and I don't feel the need to change them. I want to flesh out my two-way comparisons since that's what I do most, and they need the most beefing up. And with the ranking system, there's already margins accounted for in the multi-way comparisons. If you do well in a pose, you'll place higher, and if you suck, you'll place lower. There's already variability in the scores. But I don't feel the need to have the same scoring system for my two-way comparisons as I do for the multi-way comparisons. It's just not necessary to overcomplicate already big comparison videos like those. But for my two-way comparisons, how am I scoring them? Well, let's get into it. There are going to be 2 categories of scoring with a couple of smaller things underneath those broader categories. The first category, the most important one, is the mandatory poses. And obviously each of those contribute to the score. It's not just about who wins the most, because now I will be accounting for margins in these videos. Like I said, I've been able to account for margins sort of with my 3- and 4-way comparisons, but not in a 2-way comparison. But now that I'm overhauling my scoring system, that's what I'm doing. Because I've always found the need to include some type of margin system. Because in a regular 2-way comparison, if you won a pose, it would only be worth 1 point. But that doesn't account for if you won the pose by a little bit, or a lot, or if it was a 50-50 type of split, all of which are important to note in this mandatory round. So here's what I came up with. A regular win will be worth 2 points, a dominant win worth 3 points, and a small victory is worth just 1 point. And as I'm doing this video, I did realize that Superset Man does something very, very similar to this, but I already asked him and he says he doesn't mind. I did think about doing half points, points, and 1.5 point margins to do this, but that just doesn't tickle my brain the way whole numbers do. So this is what I'm settling on. And then for this section, I will total up all the points that each gentleman scored, and then take their own number of points scored and divide that by the total score. So let's say a competitor scored 12 points, but altogether both guys scored a total of 20 points. I would take 12, divide that by 20, multiply that by 100, and that would be their percentage grade for this first section of the scoring. And that percentage, the entire mandatory round in general, is the most important. And I think a fair number to use to indicate this is 2/3. So a gentleman's score here will be worth 2/3 of their final score. Now for the other 1/3 of the scoring, I have what we call the whole physique categories. I've been talking about these a lot in my comparisons, but now I'm ready to actually quantify them. So the overall physique categories have to do with the overall physique, not just one pose. And the categories I look at are overall condition, overall muscularity, which includes completeness as well, overall shape/aesthetics, and a flaws category. Now those are all pretty self-explanatory, but the flaws category has been interesting. Basically, it's just things that are wrong. Injuries, suspect oil use, and even bad posing can be thrown in here, which just worked best, by the way. I originally had a posing category in my system, but it was just messing the scores up too much for something actual judges just don't care about anymore, quite frankly. But I still care about it somewhat. I'm not going to give it its own category, so I don't stray too far from the official judging, but I definitely care about it enough to work it in. And nowadays in the modern era, since posing is really only a problem when it's bad, it's going to be thrown in the flaws category. And like I said, I don't think I need to explain what constitutes good overall muscularity, conditioning, and shape by this point in the video. But how will these 4 categories be scored? Well, just like the mandatories. After examining the physiques, a competitor will get a score 1 to 3 in the category they win to reflect their margin of victory. If a competitor has way better shape than his opponent, he'll get a 3-point win in that category. Or if a competitor has slightly better completeness than his opponent, then he'll get a slight 1-point win in that muscularity department. Then, like in the mandatory round, I will add up all the points possible and divide each competitor's score by the total. And then multiply that number by 100, and then that will be the score for this round. And then at the end, I'll make that score 1/3 of the entire comparison, with the other 2/3 from the mandatory round, and then we'll be able to calculate the final scores. Now, a lot of you will probably think, why even include this in the scoring? Don't the mandatories take all these things into account? Aren't you just redoing what the mandatories already accomplished when you include the whole physique categories? Well, no, they're actually different, and there is value in examining the physiques from a different perspective. If you guys want a really good real-life example of this, take the 2018 Mr. Olympia. Phil was winning on mandatories. I'm pretty sure everyone agrees on this. He won more poses compared to Sean Roden. However, I think we would also all agree that Phil did not deserve to win the Olympia, and he didn't, because of that terrible gut. But the gut really only affected him in 3 shots, and he would win the back poses by a 3-point margin in my eyes, and he did well in a lot of other shots. So if we didn't take into account overall shape as well as other things, Sean couldn't have won. He wouldn't have won the mandatories by enough. He wouldn't have even won the most mandatories at all. But because we also take the whole physique into account, including shape and flaws, which Phil lost badly, this would have tipped the scales into Sean's favor, which is what happened, and I agree with that. And I think that is a very fair and accurate way to judge and score a comparison. So let's put it into action and run a scenario. I've laid out all my criteria and my new scoring system, so let's get a hands-on example of my judging in action. Now keep in mind, this is not a real comparison, this is just an example. I'll be breezing through these poses as fast as I can while still touching on the criteria and how I would score these guys so we can see these things in action. Don't get your posing trunks in a twist over this one, this is simply an example. So first off here we have the front double. Both guys do have good X-frames. Hadi does have the better arms just by a little thanks to them being a little bit harder, and Samson's being too flat and blurry. So Hadi is good in the main component, the overall X-frame, even if Samson is slightly winning, and Hadi also wins the second component, the arms. But what I think really sets Hadi apart is the overall conditioning. Hadi wins the legs because of that. Samson's are bigger, but Hadi's are clearly more separated and very developed too, so he takes this area as well. And that's the story for the rest of the physique. Hadi has the harder and drier upper body, including the more detailed midsection. So Hadi wins this pose by winning all those different areas, but Samson is pretty good in this pose too. He still has a good X-frame, but I think Hadi still kind of has it all, and he pulls off a solid enough win for a 2-point victory here. He's solid, but Samson also has the size and the shape going for him too, so it's not a complete 3-point runaway. I think the front lat spread is a bit closer. Samson is again pretty solid. He has a good X-frame, although his waist could be a little bit tighter and the stomach a bit flatter. But I think Hadi's overall shape is slightly worse. I think his balance is hurt a little bit now. His upper body and the shoulder width and the lat width are so wide that they're making his legs look a bit narrow. Now for the lats themselves, I do have Hadi pretty clearly. His lats are so much wider than Samson. And for the lower body, I now have Samson and Hadi neck and neck. Hadi is still more peeled, but Samson's legs look a lot better here. He still has impressive sweep in his quads, but he looks more detailed than the last pose. And in all those bonus areas like the arms, delts, and chest, I have Samson. He is much fuller in all of those areas. And also, if you look closely, Hadi has a suspect delt. That looks like synthol use or maybe years of bad shots. Whatever it is, it's distracting, so I think that really brings him down on this pose. That's a major flaw to have. But Hadi still does manage to do a lot of things right and win this pose. His overall conditioning and hardness, the tighter waist, and most importantly the wider lats win him this pose. I think this would have been a 2 or even 3-point win if it weren't for the delts, however. They really bug me, so he wins, but only by 1 point. The side chest is the closest pose so far. Remember, this pose is about how thick you are from the side angle. And that is the one thing that Samson does do correctly. He's very full and round all over, and he beats Hadi in size in a lot of areas. The side leg is bigger, the arm and the delt are very round, and his pecs are rounder than Hadi's. But in literally all of these different areas, Hadi is more detailed and separated. And he looks incredibly wide shoulder to shoulder with a locked in midsection. So he looks wide up top, and that trims down to a small waist. That's the textbook streamline look. And that width really helps him against the bigger Samson. I don't know if it's quite enough though. This one I can kind of go back and forth on. But in an effort to save time, let's just go ahead and give Samson this pose at least. You'll see that it won't really matter anyway. But still, it's only going to be a 1-point victory since I like both guys. The rear double is kind of a mediocre pose for each guy. They don't really have a whole lot going on in large portions of the back. I do think Hadi slightly takes the back department though because of the conditioning mostly. He's a bit harder, and with that I think he has the slightly crisper detail, where you can find it at least compared to Samson. He also has the denser mid back. What's honestly more convincing for Hadi are the limbs. He's winning in the lower body because even though Samson has more size, Hadi still has a decent size but better conditioning. I'd even have Hadi in the upper limbs. His delts are dwarfing Samson's, so he wins there even though Hadi's delts appear to be a bit lumpy, if you catch my drift. And in the arms, like in the front double, Samson's just flattened out. Hadi has a more pronounced peak on his biceps and even some faint tricep feathers, which are a nice touch. Overall, this pose is won fairly clearly everywhere but the back. But it's really just because the back isn't a knockout for either of them. Again, I see both of them as a little lackluster. But Hadi still gets the better of Samson here, not by much though. And because both guys are mid and the back the most important part of the pose, I'm giving Hadi this win, but only by a 1-point margin because his victory isn't super compelling. But neither of them are. The rear lat spread is back to being a pretty clear win, and yet again it's for Hadi. The lower body goes to Hadi like in the last back pose for the same reasons, but now the back is what's different. In terms of back detail, both guys were meh in the rear double, but now we're mainly focused on the width of each competitor, and Hadi is clearly wider. Samson has okay width too, but he's getting beat by Hadi, a shorter guy, and it's by a noticeable amount too. Hadi's lats also insert lower, which is a plus for him. Hadi's lower back region with the spinal erectors look thicker, and his traps are good too, but to be fair, I think Samson does have Hadi beat in the traps, just by the traps themselves though. So Samson all in all is pretty solid, but I have Hadi winning this one fairly easily. He gets a smaller win in the lower body and wins the back by a good margin. But because Samson is not outright dropping the ball, he prevents Hadi from locking up a 3-point margin on this one. So 2 points to Hadi. The side tricep is a pose that I've always gone back and forth with these two on. Samson has the bigger tricep, but it's not very separated, and he is also bigger and thicker from this angle, and that's very important. But his waist protrudes just a little bit. Hadi, on the other hand, doesn't have the biggest tricep. It's solid but not huge. He's not even the thickest from the side. But his conditioning and the details he carries are unmatched, and he has that streamlined look. Samson is more so looking like a big ball of clay, while Hadi looks more like a finished sculpture. Hadi has the better midsection, it's tighter and infinitely more detailed. The pecs and the side leg are also more detailed. I gotta say, I like Hadi's quality more and his streamlined appearance, but he's missing the important elements of extra thickness and the bigger tricep. Like I said, I go back and forth on this one a lot, but let's just throw Samson a bone and give him this one. Not by a super big margin though. Like I said, it can go back and forth, so this is just going to be a 1-point win for Samson. And then here in the abs and thighs, we have a pose that is without a doubt a clear win for Hadi. And sure, I could have included Samson's twisting oblique shot that I showed earlier, but even that wouldn't be enough. Hadi's abs and thighs is probably the best in the current roster of the Open IFBB. His ab separation and development is miles ahead of Samson. Hadi has the piano keys, aka the obliques, coming in hot, and his abs are so much deeper than Samson's. And Hadi's waist control and his taper are also far better than Samson's. And even though Hadi's legs are smaller, in my opinion, it's still a win for Hadi because of all of that detail. So Hadi cleans up here in this pose and gets a very dominant win, awarding him 3 points in this pose. And finally, we've made it to the last pose. You would think that Samson's size advantage would help him win this one, but again, he just looks like a big ball of mass. Sure, it gets him close because he's so full and round everywhere, but everything is just blurring together. Not to mention his stomach looks a tad big here. Hadi doesn't have the size of Samson, let's make that clear, but bottom to top, he blows Samson out of the water in terms of detail. The quads are more separated, the midsection isn't even a contest on any metric, the arms and delts are more separated from each other, and his chest is the only one in this comparison with any striations. Another thing that really helps Hadi is his shoulder to shoulder width. That allows him to take up much more space on stage and helps him to look a bit bigger next to Samson. Still though, this is close because although I have Hadi winning, Samson has most of what he needs. He has more size in all the body parts, but the crucial element of detail is missing. And also because Samson is so big, I can see an argument for him. He's very impressive, and that's kind of what this pose is all about. And he's impressive in the most correct way by being the most muscular. But Hadi has everything, size, density, and way more detail, so I'm giving him a 1-point win. Alright, so we've gone through the mandatories, but we'll look at the final scores in a minute. Let's first continue the scoring process by examining the overall physique categories. Remember, there are 4 categories, and let's go ahead and start with something easy and begin with conditioning. It's no question that Hadi is winning this by the full 3-point margin. Samson got close in some poses thanks to his size, but in every pose I kept saying over and over again that Hadi was more peeled everywhere. He made Samson look very soft by comparison. Next, let's go to muscularity. Now, I do think Hadi wins this one, but just barely. He wins because he is slightly more complete and had more density to his muscles. Samson wins in terms of quantity of muscle, but Hadi wins on the quality and has enough quantity for him to sneak by in this category with just 1 point. Now let's go to a Samson win finally. Let's talk about the shape category. He wins. I think he has the overall better structure. He's less blocky than Hadi, but honestly not by much, which is really surprising. Like, Hadi won the front double because of his shape being fairly solid. But I think we can all agree that Samson is pretty aesthetic, but I don't think we can say the same thing about Hadi definitively. So I'll be giving Samson the shape category by 1 point. And finally, that brings us to the flaws category. And they both had fairly big ones at the show. Samson had stomach control issues, but Hadi had those very interesting delts. Those both are pretty big deals, but I have to be honest, the pointy delts matter to me a lot more. When Samson did get into poses, for the most part, he kept his waist in check, but Hadi could not run from those delts. In fact, they almost lost him a pose and are definitely very distracting. So I think Hadi has the more detrimental flaw, so he loses this category. And in this type of scoring system, that means Samson gets the points. But in this case, it's just a 1-point victory since both guys have something I'm really not fond of. And finally, let's tally up the scores. Now keep in mind, again, this is just an example. If I really deliberated these poses and the categories, I probably would have had a point there taken away or a point there given, but overall I think this does match my opinion very well, and the consensus of the fans after the show, which was that Hadi won by a landslide. Most YouTubers and commentators said that, most fans agree, even Tyler Mannion barely bothered with his recap of the show when it came to the top 2. Hadi in fact dominated the 2024 Arnold Classic. And if we get into my scores, that's definitely what I saw too. First off, in the mandatories, there were 12 points total. Samson scored just 2 of those points and Hadi scored the remaining 10. So for each gentleman, I took their personal scores and divided those numbers by the total number of points possible. Hadi scored 83.3% here, and Samson got the remaining 16.7. Now remember, these scores will be worth 2/3 of the final score, but let's keep moving. Now we have the overall physique categories, and here there were 6 points possible. Hadi got 4 of those, and Samson got the remaining 2. So let's repeat that process. Divide both competitors' scores by 6, and that's their grade for this round. Hadi gets 66.7%, and Hadi gets the remaining 33.3%. And these scores will be worth 1/3 of the final total. And let's go ahead and get into that final total. If you add up Samson and Hadi's score and weight them accordingly, 1/3 for the overall physique categories and 2/3 for the mandatories, this comes out to a resounding Hadi victory. Samson received a final score of 22.18, and Hadi a score of 77.82. And you'll notice that this adds up to a perfect 100, and that is because this is out of the same score. It's kind of like calculating a semester grade for your class, but at the same time it's a little different because these guys are competing for the same points throughout the scoring, which means you'll just about always see scores ranging from 30-ish to the high 60s. But hey, sometimes you'll get a score like this where there's a massive gap. And based on everything we know about the Arnold and what we just looked at, I would say that this accurately reflects what happened on that stage. And that's it. That's my new judging system, including my criteria for everything, for every pose, my own scoring system, and of course a nice example for you. Now, I'm always evolving. This will not be the last time I overhaul my judging criteria, and I'm always open for criticism and your thoughts. So as the official criteria shifts or as my own thoughts may morph a little, and if you guys have some good ideas, expect this criteria to change. Now, I don't plan on revisiting this often. This is how it's probably going to be for a while, but if in 2 years I see the need to change something, I'll revisit and redo this video. And please leave me your thoughts about my criteria and more importantly, the judging system. I'm going to implement this for the next several of my videos. So as we go along and see this in action, leave me your thoughts. If the reception is absolutely awful, I guess, I'll consider doing something else, but for now, this is what we're rocking and rolling with. But I don't really anticipate you guys hating on this one too much. But again, leave me your thoughts. Whether you're a new fan of the channel, longtime fans, I want to hear everyone's opinions and possible suggestions down in the comments. And if you guys like the way I do things on this channel, be sure to hit the like button on this video and subscribe so you stay up to date on all my future videos. I of course do bodybuilding comparison videos, but that's not all. I cover every major pro show live, I do other live streams, I cover all the important news you guys need to know from the world of bodybuilding, I host the Project Bodybuilding podcast, and much, much more. So if you guys like bodybuilding content, there is something for you on this channel, I assure you that, so hit that subscribe button. And with all that said, I'm going to go ahead and end this video here. Let me say it one more time for the people in the back: like, comment, subscribe, and I will see you all in the next video.
Get in Lexia.